Bias.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping ourselves into the history books to re-examine what might be the single most contentious piece of physical evidence in 20th century American history, Commission Exhibit 399.
It really is. It's the object that launched, literally 1,000 conspiracy theories.
And it has a name.
It does. Colloquially, dismissively, and, well, perhaps unfairly, it's known as the magic bullet.
That's right. We are diving deep into the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy, but with a very specific mission. We're not here to debate motives or politics or even the identity of the shooter.
Yeah, our mission today is laser-focused, almost microscopically focused, you could say.
We're looking at the forensic physics. We're taking this just enormous stack of sources. The Warren Commission, the HSCA reports, independent ballistic studies, modern metallurgical science, and we're asking one key question about the single bullet theory, or SBT.
Is it truly magic?
Or is it merely highly improbable, but at the end of the day, physically possible?
And to do that, you really have to suspend your intuitive reaction. You have to. When you hear the basic premise that one small 6.5 millimeter projectile caused 7 distinct injuries across 2 grown men,
President Kennedy and Governor Connally,
and was then recovered mostly intact, your gut, your immediate reaction just screams, impossible.
It does. It sounds like something out of a movie.
But our job here, what we're going to do is move beyond that intuition and really dig into the empirical data.
So let's list them. 7 injuries. It's just a jaw-dropping sequence. You got 2 on Kennedy, right? The entry and exit wounds in the neck.
Correct. And then 5 on Governor Connally.
An entry in the back, a fractured rib, a chest exit wound, then a fractured wrist, and finally a shallow wound in his thigh.
It's an incredible chain of events. And the bullet, the CE-399, was recovered flattened at its base and slightly bent.
The central conflict here, as you've said, is possibility versus probability. The public sees the probability as what, near zero?
Absolutely. But what our sources establish and what we're going to unpack is that under a very specific, highly constrained set of conditions,
we're talking velocity, geometry, the type of munition.
Under those conditions, the possibility remains surprisingly high.
And we have a really comprehensive source list here. This isn't just one report. We're talking decades of analysis. We have the foundational material from the big official inquiries, sure.
But we also have these incredibly technical experimental data sets from places like Edgewood Arsenal and, crucially, these modern metallurgical reevaluations that completely, and I mean completely, change the landscape of the forensic evidence.
So the structure for our deep dive today, it's designed to tackle that skepticism head on.
Right. We're deconstructing this whole event into 4 critical vectors. First, the behavior of the specific munition used,
which is so important and so often overlooked.
Then the precise, and I mean almost to the inch, the spatial geometry of the limousine. Third, the wound pathology, so the biological interaction.
And finally, and this might be the most interesting part, the psychological biases that make this whole theory so resistant to acceptance, even when the physics seems to check out.
Exactly. Why do we want to call it magic?
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the projectile itself, right?
Yeah.
Because the physics of that specific bullet determines everything that followed.
Everything.
So when people discuss the bullet, they rarely specify what kind of bullet it was. They just assume all bullets behave the same.
Which is a huge mistake. Here, the specifics are, they're just paramount. We are talking about the 6.5 by 52 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano cartridge manufactured by the Western Cartridge Company, WCC.
And this is maybe the most overlooked element in the whole public discussion.
It has to be. I mean, if Lee Harvey Oswald had been using a more contemporary rifle, say firing a modern high-velocity round like the NATO standard 5.56 Spitzer.
Something designed to tumble and fragment.
Precisely. If he'd used that, then this entire chain of events, particularly the lack of fragmentation in Kennedy's neck, becomes physically impossible. The whole theory dies right there.
So why is the Carcano round so different? What's its story?
Well, it's about its age and its design purpose. Our sources detail that it was a round-nosed, fully metal-jacketed projectile, an FMJ.
And that's key. Unlike modern military ammo, which is designed to tumble or fragment to maximize tissue damage.
The Carcano was designed for penetration. It's an old military design philosophy. It had a substantial lead core encased in a very, very thick copper alloy jacket.
So it's designed to punch through, not explode on impact.
That's it. And this round nose profile gives it two key features. First, a high sectional density, which allows it to maintain exceptional gyroscopic stability in the air.
I think I saw one researcher likened its path to a badly thrown football that quickly self-corrects and just flies straight.
That's a perfect analogy. But the real game changer, the thing that unlocks this whole puzzle, is how that stability translates when it hits soft tissue.
Okay, let's define that behavior. We're talking about projectile stability in this concept of yaw cycles. When a bullet hits water or, soft tissue, it immediately starts to interact with a medium that is way denser than air.
Exactly. And when a bullet enters a denser medium, these drag forces, they begin to overcome the bullet's rotational inertia. That's the stability it gets from the rifling spin.
And that causes the bullet to deviate from its initial point-forward path and start to, tumble.
It begins a yaw cycle, yes, a tumble. Modern, marginally stable projectiles, they often yaw almost instantly upon impact.
But the 𝐃𝐿 did not.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's the Rosetta Stone concept for the single bullet theory.
It is. It absolutely is. Researchers like Larry Sturdivant, who is doing these tests at Edgewood Arsenal, confirmed that this 𝐃𝐿 round is what they term marginally stable in soft tissue. And this leads directly to a phenomenon called delayed instability.
Delayed instability. So how far can this particular bullet travel point forward inside the body before it starts to yaw?
The tests were quite specific. It travels point forward for a depth of between 15 and 20 centimeters.
So about 6 to 8 inches.
Right. And only after traveling that distance does the drag overcome the spin, and the rotational inertia induces that full tumbling yaw. That time delay is everything.
And when we map that onto President Kennedy's injury,
we finally realize why the wound complex was so neat. The bullet traversed his neck. The measured soft tissue depth from the C6 entry point to the throat exit was approximately 14 centimeters.
And 14 centimeters is less than the 15 to 20 needed to make it tumble.
Exactly. So the bullet remained point forward the entire time it was inside the president's neck.
It essentially drilled a neat, clean hole. It transferred minimal kinetic energy and caused very little tissue disruption or fragmentation.
Which explains why the exit wound was so small and clean, and that brings us right to the next point of major public skepticism, the appearance of CE-399.
The pristine fallacy. The public saw this bullet, flattened and a little bent, and their intuition just said it should have been destroyed if it struck bone.
Right. But our sources are really careful to caution against using the word pristine. What's the official description of its condition?
It's definitely not pristine. It is measurably flattened at its base. That's where the lead core was pushed up against the jacket, and it has a slight bend along its longitudinal axis.
And that specific deformation profile is physically reproducible, but only when we understand what's called the energy budget explanation, the deceleration sequence.
We have to track the energy expenditure through all 7 of those injury points. So where did the bullet start, and what energy did it lose along the way?
Okay, so the muzzle velocity for that specific WCC load was high, around 2,100 to 2,200 feet per second. That's its initial kinetic energy.
A huge amount of energy.
A huge amount. It lost a measurable chunk just going through 14 centimeters of JFK's neck and then more traversing the air gap.
And then it hit Governor Connolly's torso and smashed his 5th rib. I mean, that must have been a massive energy dump.
It was. The transit through the soft tissue, the shattering of the rib bone, and then the subsequent path to the wrist. All of that drastically reduced the velocity.
What's the estimate? How fast was it going when it hit the final bone?
The crucial estimate, and this is backed by experimental data, is that upon striking Connolly's radius bone, the final hardest bone impact, the bullet was traveling at approximately 900 feet per second.
900, so that's less than half its starting velocity.
Way less than half. It's subsonic at that point.
So the bullet's survival is entirely dependent on that velocity drop. How did researchers even prove that 900 feet per second was the magic number?
This is where Dr. John Latimer's comparative testing becomes absolutely essential. He didn't just fire the rifle into, a block of gelatin. He meticulously conducted tests using reduced powder charges in 6.5 millimeter 𝐃𝐿 cartridges to simulate that expected terminal velocity.
So he's creating a bullet that's already slowed down before it hits the target.
Precisely. He tested the impact of these rounds against human radius bones sourced from cadavers at various velocities, specifically targeting that 900 feet per second range.
And what did the 900 feet test reveal compared to, say, a full-speed 2,000 FDs test?
The results were stark. I mean, night and day. At 2050, striking the radius resulted in catastrophic fragmentation. The copper jacket, the lead core, it just shattered violently.
Gone.
Gone. But at 900 feet per second, the bullet reliably fractured the bone, often creating a comminuted or shattered fracture, but the bullet itself retained its structural integrity. The only deformation was a flattening of the base and a slight bend.
Exactly, mirroring the state of CE 399.
To a T.
That is a powerful conclusion. So the structural integrity, the very thing the public sees as impossible evidence of a conspiracy, is actually evidence for the complex trajectory and the deceleration sequence required by the SBT.
It is. If that bullet had struck the wrist at high velocity, it would have disintegrated. That would have ruled out the SBT entirely.
The bullet survived because its energy had been spent across two men.
It's a deeply counterintuitive truth, but one that's grounded firmly in material science and ballistic testing. The condition of CE 399 is consistent with having been spent, not magic.
Okay, so now we move to the anatomical geography, which caused years of confusion. This involves the location of the bullet entry wound on President Kennedy's back. Let's address the fundamental source of the early controversy: the clothing discrepancy.
This is such a classic example of forensic science misinterpreting static evidence for a dynamic event. What happened was they took measurements of the bullet holes in Kennedy's suit jacket.
5 3/8 inches below the collar.
And his shirt 5 3/4 inches below. And then they mapped those measurements onto these anatomical diagrams of a man just standing there, perfectly still.
And where did that static mapping place the entry wound?
It placed it way too low. At the third thoracic vertebra, or T3, right near the base of the neck, shoulder blade area. And this seemed to be confirmed by some of the early descriptions of the wound.
And that location created a massive geometric flaw for the SBT, didn't it?
It created what was called a geometric impossibility. We know the shooter was high up in the Texas school book depository, which means the trajectory had to be downward.
Of course.
But for a bullet to enter at that low T3 level and then exit the throat up at the C6, C7 level, it would have required an extreme upward angle. Sources estimate between 11 and 18 degrees upward.
Firing downward from a height to strike T3, and yet the bullet somehow travels upward through the body to exit the throat. I mean, that trajectory cannot be a straight line from the sniper's nest.
It absolutely cannot. And for years, critics of the SBT leaned so heavily on this geometric paradox. But the key was realizing that the clothing measurements were taken long after the event, when the clothing was just lying flat on a table.
And this is where the bunch jacket resolution comes in.
Exactly. We have to move from a static analysis to a dynamic posture. What was the president doing at that moment?
And there's visual evidence that resolved this, right?
The critical piece is the photographic evidence, specifically the Zapruder film and the associated still images like the Croft photograph, which were taken just moments before impact around frame 162.
And what do they show?
They show the president visibly waving to the crowd with his right arm raised high.
And what does that simple, dynamic human action do to a tailored suit jacket and shirt?
Well, if you raise your right arm, especially in a tailored jacket, it pulls the fabric aggressively upward and it bunches it around your neck and shoulder area. The sources confirm a visible elevation, a bunching, of 2 to 3 inches right near the hairline.
So the bullet struck the elevated fabric 5 inches down. But the skin underneath, which had remained stationary or maybe even dipped a bit due to pasture, was actually struck 2 or 3 inches higher than where the fabric hole was.
Precisely. That small adjustment, that 2 to 3 inches, is enough to align the fabric holes with the actual autopsy skin entry wound, which was significantly higher at the C6 or C7 vertebra, well above the scapula.
And when you place the entry point at C6, C7,
the downward straight-line trajectory from the 6th floor of the TSBD works perfectly to exit the throat. The T3 geometric impossibility is just. It's dissolved by a raised arm.
It's amazing how a detail as mundane as a tailored suit jacket worn by a man waving can be the missing link in a major forensic puzzle.
It just reminds us that forensic reconstruction isn't just about static geometry. It's about the physics of the system at the precise moment of impact.
Okay, now let's just quickly revisit the confusion regarding the throat exit. Why did the highly skilled Parkland Hospital physicians initially characterize that neat, small throat wound as an entry wound?
Well, it's a common but completely understandable error in trauma medicine, especially in the chaotic conditions they were facing. As we established, the bullet was stable and point forward during that 14-centimeter transit through the neck.
So it created a small, clean, circular hole when it came out.
Yes, which, counterintuitively, often looks exactly like an entry wound.
Right, doctors are generally trained to look for entry wounds as smaller and neater, while exit wounds, especially from modern, expanding, or fragmenting ammunition, are usually large and messy and stellate.
Exactly. Since this 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 FMJ round performed what was essentially a clean punch, its exit lacked the massive tissue destruction that would definitively signal an exit wound to a trauma surgeon who is, focused on saving a life in that moment.
So if the visual appearance was misleading, what definitive forensic evidence proved it was an exit?
The decisive evidence came from the examination of the president's shirt collar. Forensic analysis confirmed that the fibers around the hole were pushed outward, definitively confirming an exit vector.
Outward. Okay.
And as another detail, the bullet actually nicked the left side of his tie knot on its way out. The evidence is unambiguous. The bullet entered high on the back and exited the throat cleanly.
We've established the bullet's nature and solved the entry point confusion. Is now traveling through the air gap toward Governor Connolly. But for the public, this air gap transit, the supposed mid-air turn, remains the most powerful argument against the SBT, the infamous Zig-Zag critique.
It is the single largest visualization failure in the entire public narrative. People are constantly shown these two static diagrams, Kennedy here, Connolly there, both sitting perfectly centered in the car. And if they were in a straight line, yeah, the bullet would have missed Connolly by a mile.
So we need to correct that visualization. And to do that, we need to present the critical technical specifications of the vehicle itself. The aha moment here requires us to look at the blueprints of the 1961 Lincoln Continental limousine.
Absolutely. And the critical detail, the thing that changes everything, is the jump seat offset. Governor Connolly was not seated directly in front of the president. He was in the jump seat, which was a customized element of that car.
Let's break down the precise measurements from the blueprints and the CAD models.
Okay, first, the lateral position. Connolly's jump seat was situated a crucial 6 inches inboard.
Meaning 6 inches to the left?
6 inches to the left relative to the position of the president, who was seated far back toward the right door line on that elevated rear bench. 6 inches is a massive difference in ballistics geometry.
It's huge. So the bullet exits Kennedy's throat and is already traveling slightly leftward toward Connolly. But what about the vertical elevation?
That's the second crucial factor. The jump seat itself was considerably lower than the rear bench. Connolly's position was approximately 4 to 6 inches lower than the president's seat.
So let me just visualize this. The shooter is elevated, firing down. Kennedy is sitting high up on the back bench. Connolly is forward, 6 inches to the left, and 4 to 6 inches lower down.
Exactly. Now imagine drawing a straight line from that 6th floor window. That line, because of the height of the building and the depth of the car on the road, it has a significant downward angle. When you map that straight line through JFK's C6 entry point, through his throat exit, that line just continues downward and leftward, directly into the entry point on Governor Connolly's back.
It seems almost too simple, yet it's been missed for decades because of this basic assumption about the seating arrangement.
It's Euclidean geometry obscured by perception. The 3D trajectory analysis that's been performed using CAD models, like the ones presented to the American Bar Association during their mock trials and the evidence, proves conclusively that the magic bullet trajectory is, in fact, a straight line.
The perceived turn, or zigzag, relies entirely on that flawed assumption that the two passengers were perfectly vertically and laterally aligned.
That's it. Once you account for the actual seating geometry of that specific limousine, the flight path of the bullet is entirely rational.
It's physically sound. The non-alignment of the jump seat is the critical evidence that dissolves the magic.
It really is.
So the bullet, now marginally unstable, has made its straight-line journey and impacts Governor Connolly. We now shift to the wound pathology within the governor's body, which is crucial because the bullet's behavior upon striking Connolly provides independent confirmation of its condition upon leaving Kennedy.
And this is the forensic beauty of the sequence. The wounds on Connolly tell us exactly what the bullet was doing right before it struck him. And we start with the entry wound on his back, just below the right armpit. Surgeons noted it was elliptical, or
keyhole-shaped.
Yes, keyhole-shaped. It measured roughly 1.5 centimeters by 0.8 centimeters.
Why is that keyhole shape the definitive piece of evidence here?
Because in terminal ballistics, a perfect circular wound is created by a stable point-forward projectile. A keyhole or elliptical wound is the signature of a projectile that is striking the tissue edge on or at a steep yaw angle. It means the bullet was tumbling at the moment of impact.
And if the bullet had come straight from the rifle, it would have been stable and created a nice, neat, circular entry wound.
Absolutely. The tumbling confirms its destabilization. This confirms the sequence we detailed in Section 1. The bullet traveled 14 centimeters through JFK's neck, was destabilized, began to yaw in the air gap, and then struck Connolly while it was still in that rotational cycle.
The keyhole entry is the physical signature proving the transit through JFK's neck had to have occurred. It's a perfect chain of causation.
It is.
So let's follow the bullet through the thoracic transit. What was the internal damage like inside the governor's chest?
The bullet traversed Connolly's chest, and it fractured his fifth rib. This was a significant bone interaction, and it confirmed the loss of an estimated 10 centimeters of rib material.
So this impact constitutes the second major deceleration event for CE 399.
It does. The bullet's velocity dropped again, and its structural integrity was really tested.
And the exit wound on the governor's chest was large, around 5 centimeters, which is much larger than the exit on Kennedy's throat. Why the big difference?
Because the bullet was now tumbling aggressively, having smashed a rib, it was transferring its kinetic energy much more violently than it did in JFK's neck. Moreover, the exit wound included the expulsion of shattered rib fragments.
So they act as secondary missiles.
Exactly. They tear open the exit pathway. A tumbling bullet carrying bone shrapnel creates a far larger, much more irregular exit cavity.
Which brings us back, one last time, to the most cited impossibility.
Yeah.
The wrist fracture. How could this already spent, tumbling bullet smash the governor's radius bone and survive?
We just have to return to the velocity check and the Latimer findings. By the time the bullet reached the wrist, having traveled through JFK, through the air, through Connolly's rib and chest muscle, its velocity was down to around 900 feet per second.
Subsonic. Far below the speed required for it to fragment.
Right. So it had just enough kinetic energy remaining to shatter the bone. The fracture was famously comminuted, meaning it was shattered into many small pieces, but it just didn't have enough speed to self-destruct.
That's the balance. And again, the specific wound detail here supports the tumbling nature, doesn't it?
It does. Forensic examination of the wrist wound showed that fabric fibers from Connolly's suit or shirt were driven into the wound. This is highly characteristic of a tumbling, irregular missile that catches and scrapes and tears material, rather than a stable bullet that would have cleanly sliced through.
And then the final act, the thigh embedment.
Right. The bullet exited the shattered wrist and made a superficial entry into the left thigh, lodging only in the subcutaneous tissue.
Just under the skin, basically.
Essentially, yes.
And superficial indicates the end of the line.
Precisely. The bullet was completely spent. This lack of depth proves it had effectively zero residual velocity. It had completed its single, destructive, energy-dissipating path. The bullet was whole, but only because it had done its job and slowed down.
And that leads directly to the question of its discovery location on the stretcher at Parkland Hospital.
Given the superficial nature of that thigh wound, it is highly, highly probable that the bullet just worked its way out or was dislodged by movement during transport or treatment. Its ultimate location on the stretcher, beneath the mattress, is perfectly consistent with a spent projectile that simply fell out of a shallow wound.
Okay, so we've established the physical case for the single bullet theory based on geometry and ballistics. But for decades, many scientists also believed they had chemical proof. Now we get to tackle a truly fascinating story of scientific self-correction, the rise and fall of neutron activation analysis, or NAA.
This is such a critical pivot point in the forensic analysis of this whole event. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the HSCA, hired a Dr. Vincent Ginn, who was a leading expert, to perform NAA on all the recovered lead fragments. And at the time, this was absolutely cutting-edge science.
What exactly was Dr. Ginn trying to determine using NAA?
He was trying to establish a chemical fingerprint for the lead in the bullets. NAA detects trace elements, specifically antimony and silver, that are alloyed with the lead core to make it harder.
And his hypothesis was what? That the concentration would be unique.
Ginn hypothesized that the specific concentration of antimony in the lead of a given bullet batch would be unique enough to distinguish fragments that came from different projectiles.
And what did Ginn conclude based on his analysis?
His findings were seen as definitive. He said the lead fragments recovered from Governor Connolly's wrist, that's CE 842, matched the specific trace element profile of the stretcher bullet, CE 399, to a high statistical probability.
So his conclusion was they must have come from the same bullet.
Yes. And conversely, fragments found in President Kennedy's head wound matched a different chemical profile, indicating a separate second shot. This seemed, chemically, to confirm the SBT and the whole single-shooter scenario.
So for almost 30 years, NAA was the chemical bedrock supporting the SBT. But then that all collapsed in 2006 with the metallurgical rebuttal by Eric Randich and Patrick Grant. How could a respected scientist like Dr. Gwynn make such a fundamental error?
Well, the error wasn't in the NAA technique itself. It's an excellent way to measure trace elements. The error was in the premise, the assumption that the trace elements were uniformly distributed throughout the bullet and that the concentration was unique to a batch.
And Randich and Grant, looking at the industrial manufacturing process, proved this assumption was false.
Completely false.
Let's get into the weeds of manufacturing here. Tell us about this concept of lead microsegregation.
It all boils down to how WCC made their bullet cores. They relied on these immense mixtures of scrap lead, often melted together in vast industrial-scale ingots. Antimony is added to strengthen the lead.
Right.
But when these massive ingots of molten lead and antimony start to cool a process that takes days or even weeks, the elements don't mix and stay perfectly suspended like dye and water.
So if the ingot cools slowly,
the antimony crystallizes at different rates. This differential cooling creates microsegregation. Pockets of higher and lower trace element concentrations within the same ingot and, crucially, within the same bullet.
it's like pouring chocolate chip cookie batter into a huge pan. The chips, the antimony, will be clustered more densely in some areas than in others.
That's a perfect analogy. And if the trace element isn't uniform, it just destroys the entire concept of the chemical fingerprint.
It has to.
And Randich and Grant did the work. They performed detailed analysis, slicing single WCC bullets and measuring the antimony levels at the nose, the middle, and the base. They found significant intra-bullet variance.
And this leads to two critical flaws in Gwynn's original conclusion. What was the impact of the intra-bullet variance?
The first flaw is that Gwynn might have taken a sample from the nose of CE-399, which had low antimony, and compared it to a sample from the base, which had high antimony. They would appear statistically different, leading to a false negative, suggesting two different bullets when they were actually from one.
And the second flaw, interbullet homogeneity.
That's the opposite problem. Because WCC used such massive, consistent master melts, two entirely separate bullets from two different boxes or even different manufacturing years could share the same average antimony profile.
So that leads to a false positive.
A false positive. Gwynn's analysis could only prove that the fragments came from a bullet consistent with the WCC melt used for CE-399, not that they definitively came from CE-399 itself.
So the chemical conclusion is essentially rendered moot.
That is the current consensus in the forensic community. The 2006 study concluded that NAA data provides, and I'm quoting, no forensic basis to determine the number of bullets that caused the injuries. It can't disprove the SBT, but it certainly can't prove it either.
It's an invalidated line of evidence. This is a major correction for our listeners.
Yeah.
The validity of the SBT has to now rely solely on the physical evidence, the geometry, the timing, and the specific behavior of the Kharkana munition.
That's right. It stands or falls on physics alone.
We've established the physics and geometry are plausible. But we still have to reconcile the human element, particularly the timeline of the attack. Lee Harvey Oswald was using a bolt-action rifle, which imposes a strict temporal constraint.
And the Zapruder film provides the definitive clock for this. Because the rifle had to be manually cycled between shots, there is a very real temporal constraint. Forensic studies determine that the minimum time required for Oswald to operate the bolt, reacquire the target, and fire a second shot is 2.3 seconds.
That's approximately 42 frames of the 18.3 frames per second Zapruder film. So if the impacts on Kennedy and Connally were separated by 2.3 seconds or more, the SBT collapses. If they were simultaneous, it holds.
And this brings us to that famous conflict, the subjective testimony of Governor Connally. He testified, and quite sincerely, that he heard the shot, turned to his right to look, and then he felt the blow. That sequence strongly suggests two separate shots.
But the physical evidence provided by the film has to override that subjective testimony. Where is the simultaneity evidence?
It centers on Zapruder frame 224. This frame is the physical anchor for the entire theory. We observe two instantaneous, involuntary reactions happening at the exact same time.
The first being President Kennedy's arms raising.
Yes, his arms are captured raising in the Thorburns position, which is a classic involuntary neuromuscular shock response to a sudden impact near the spine.
And at that exact same frame, there's a physical reaction on Connally's body.
Yes. The lapel flip. The left lapel of Governor Connolly's suit jacket is visibly flipping violently outward.
And what is that?
Ballistic reconstructionists interpret that lapel flip as the instantaneous expansion of the temporary cavity, the shock wave caused by the bullet traversing his chest and smashing his rib. This is an immediate physical marker that synchronizes the impact on both men to the very same fraction of a second.
That visual evidence is pretty damning to the idea of a delay. A 2.3-second delay was showed two clearly separate events on the film.
It would be obvious. The physics confirm simultaneity, so now we must address the governor's testimony through the lens of psychoacoustics and reaction lag. Why did he remember a delay if the impacts were simultaneous?
And he was a highly decorated combat veteran.
Yeah.
He was clearly trying to give the most accurate account possible.
He was, absolutely. And his account is true to his experience, but it's not true to the physics. The key is neurological lag, a voluntary motor reaction. The decision to turn, the experience of pain, the grimace, it takes time for the brain to process and execute, anywhere from 200 to 500 milliseconds.
So the physical shockwave, the lapel flip, JFK's arms, that happens instantly at frame 224, but Connolly's voluntary decision to turn and feel the pain happens frames after the impact.
Correct. The event was instantaneous, but the perception was delayed. And furthermore, we need to consider the speed of sound versus the speed of the bullet.
Right. The bullet was traveling at about 2,000 feet per second. Sound travels at about 1,100.
The bullet travels faster than the sound of the shot. Connolly was hit by the bullet before the sound of the rifle blast even reached his ears. What he likely heard first was the supersonic shockwave, the crack of the bullet passing nearby, or perhaps the muzzle blast of a prior shot, one that many theories suggest missed the limousine entirely.
So he hears this crack, he initiates a voluntary turn, and then the single bullet that just exited JFK hits him instantly. His brain received the auditory stimulus first, followed by the tactile, the pain stimulus, and it just organized them sequentially.
Even though the impact was simultaneous with the sound's arrival, under the intense, stress-induced conditions of an assassination attempt, the brain frequently reorders auditory and tactile stimuli to try and create a coherent narrative. His testimony is sincere, but the physical evidence, the Zapruder film synchronization, it has to take precedence.
And the timeline supports the SBT perfectly.
It does.
So we have spent a considerable amount of time establishing that the single bullet theory is physically plausible, it's geometrically sound, and it's temporally coherent. The physics works, the math checks out, the ballistics are reproducible. Yet for decades, it has been and continues to be intensely rejected by a large segment of the public.
And this is where the discussion moves from forensic science to human psychology. If the data is sound, the skepticism must be rooted in something psychological, not physical.
And our sources define that root cause as proportionality bias.
It's an inherent, powerful cognitive tendency. This bias suggests that we, as humans, automatically assume that events of tremendous magnitude, like the assassination of a president, must have equally significant, massive, and complex causes.
A vast conspiracy, multiple shooters, a shadowy plot. The scale of the event demands a commensurate explanation. The effect altering the course of the Cold War, sparking decades of political debate, shattering a nation, is just colossal.
And the cause, as presented by the evidence, one cheap, imperfect 6.5 millimeter bullet fired by one politically motivated, disorganized man named Lee Harvey Oswald. It feels wildly disproportionate.
It's too mundane, too chaotic, too simple for such a large historical consequence.
The dissonance is profound. If the cause is simple, the effect feels, less significant or somehow cheapened. The mind resists this.
And it's not just this event, is it?
Not at all. Think about other historical events. When the Titanic sank, the immediate public reaction gravitated towards stories of a massive avoidable flaw or even sabotage, rather than the mundane fact that the ship simply hit an iceberg and failed to turn quickly enough. The need for a grand explanation proportional to the tragedy is almost universal.
And the term magic bullet itself is a linguistic manifestation of this cognitive resistance.
Absolutely. By labeling the theory magic, the public is essentially saying, I refuse to believe the mundane, counterintuitive physics required for this outcome, therefore it must be supernatural. It's a mechanism for justifying intuitive incredulity, even when faced with empirical data.
And our sources confirm this psychological link with specific studies. Mock juror studies involving the JFK evidence found that people who scored higher on reliance on intuitive thinking, relying on gut feelings and instantaneous judgments, were significantly more likely to reject the SBT.
And conversely, those who employed rigorous analytic thinking were more likely to accept the theory once they were presented with the detailed data on yaw cycles and geometry and the jump seat.
It just highlights the challenge forensic scientists faced. They are trying to present a complex three-dimensional kinetic energy budget, but the public is reacting to a two-dimensional, static, highly charged emotional diagram.
And the complexity of the physics, the delayed yaw, the 6-inch offset, the 900 feet per second deceleration, is instantly overshadowed by the intuitive, simple, wrong image of a zigzag bullet.
It seems like the rejection of the SBT is less a failure of the science and more a failure of collective human perception in the face of chaos.
It's the difficulty of accepting that massive outcomes can stem from singular, highly constrained, and chaotic variables. The bullet's trajectory was the perfect storm of velocity, angle, proximity, and seating arrangement. Had Connolly been seated 7 inches inboard instead of 6, the physics would have failed. The plausibility rests on a razor's edge which only feeds the perception that it must be magic.
And that perception is the final challenge for any objective analysis of this event.
It really is.
That was a tremendous deep dive into the specific forensic details of Commission Exhibit 399. We have systematically addressed the core reasons for the skepticism surrounding the single bullet theory. Let's quickly recap the key insights you can now take away from this analysis.
Okay. First, forget the magic. The key to the neck transit was the specific type of munition, the WCC 6.5mm Carcano FMJ round. Its high stability results in that crucial delayed yaw cycle.
Meaning it passes cleanly through 14 centimeters of soft tissue before it even begins to tumble. And that explains the neat wounds on President Kennedy.
Second, the geometry. It's resolved entirely by the jump seat offset. Governor Connolly was seated 6 inches inboard and 4 to 6 inches lower than President Kennedy.
And once you map a straight line from the sniper's nest, it connects all 7 wounds. The perceived zigzag is just an artifact of a flawed visualization.
Third, the condition of CE 399 flattened and bent is not evidence of a missed shot or a flaw in the theory. It is the precise signature of a bullet that had successfully shed its velocity down to around 900 feet per second before striking Governor Connolly's radius bone.
Its survival is proof of its deceleration.
Exactly. Fourth, the chemical validation that stood for decades, the neutron activation analysis, is now scientifically invalidated due to the discovery of lead microsegregation in the manufacturing process. The SVT stands entirely on the strength of geometry and physics, not chemical fingerprinting.
And finally, the temporal constraints are met. The physical evidence of the lapel flip at Zapruder frame 224 synchronizes the impact on both men, overriding the neurologically lagged testimony of Governor Connolly.
So the scientific conclusion, based on decades of accumulated evidence and self-correction, is that the single bullet theory is physically possible.
But the deeper conclusion, the one in the realm of cognitive forensics, remains the most powerful.
It does. The persistence of the magic bullet skepticism shows us how intensely the human mind struggles to accept that a singular chaotic variable, a spent projectile hitting a precise, non-aligned target, can lead to the most profound, history-altering consequences.
And the difficulty in accepting chaos over conspiracy is a powerful thought for you to explore. Thank you for sharing your sources and letting us dive into the complex intersection of forensic science and human psychology.
Always a pleasure to connect the dots in the physical world and the psychological one.